Well, what does it all mean? Joining me now is Jack Richardson from the Conservative Environment Network, indeed their climate spokesman. Welcome to the programme. I suppose, first of all, there are some wins for those who are keen to decarbonise, but the Labour Party has been particularly critical of this strategy in terms of how lack of direction, perhaps, on onshore wind. There seems to be a distinction between where the government was a couple of weeks ago in trying to encourage more onshore wind, and now those targets seem to have disappeared. What's gone on?
Well, I think the Labour Party might be wrong. There is quite a clear direction being set by this strategy, and it's basically we're doubling down on our transition to clean energy. We've increased, or we are going to be increasing our offshore wind target by 25% up to 50 gigawatts. By 2030, and that includes 5 gigawatts of floating offshore wind, which accesses deeper and windier seas. I'm really pleased to see that because a group of Sen MPs have been campaigning to raise that ambition after the private sector has shown a lot of interest in floating offshore. We're also going to be doing a lot more nuclear, so ending the sort of decades of stagnation on nuclear policy. Instead of doing a nuclear decision every decade, we're going to be doing one every year, which I think is fantastic, 8 more reactors. On onshore wind, I think the government's going to be working with a few communities that really want onshore wind to build wind farms in return for lower bills. And I think that is going to prove to the government once and for all that there is much greater appetite for wind farms, including from Conservative and rural voters who live near them, and the polling backs that up. They've become much more sympathetic to them over the past 5 years or so. There are a couple of areas which could have more progress as well. So the Chancellor recently unveiled a VAT cut for home upgrades, which will increase energy efficiency, which is a really good way to cut bills quite fast. We could maybe go further on that by boosting successful energy efficiency schemes. And one key thing, which I don't think people are focusing on just yet, is if we're going to be building all this clean energy, renewables, nuclear power, and also insulating homes, we really need to start training our workforce up, because we don't have the people with the skills just yet, even though there is a massive appetite, particularly among young people, to do apprenticeships and T-levels in industries like renewables and home insulation, heat pump installation, things like that. So I'd definitely like to see that step.
This might be the crucial point of the whole strategy, might it not? Because all the things that we've been hearing about today, whether it's new nuclear power stations, well, they'll take a decade to build. Even the new wind farms, they're going to take several years to get up and running. Insulation might be slightly faster, but there doesn't seem to be a particular focus in this strategy. I suppose everything that we've heard this morning, that we're looking at and poring over, this isn't going to help us this winter. This is probably not going to help us until after the next election.
So this is basically the scale of the challenge, and I think people are definitely waking up to this. For decades, we've hooked ourselves, or Europe has hooked itself in general on Russian gas. It now supplies about 40% of that. We can't replace that overnight, especially in the UK, where even though we don't actually import much gas and oil from Russia directly, because we're so reliant on gas for heat, our prices are going up for the roof. Energy efficiency is relatively fast, and it helps people basically waste less energy. So 20% of your bill isn't literally going through the roof and through the walls. So it's basically one of the shorter term measures. In the meantime, I think the government, especially in October, when we're looking at bills going up by another up to £3,000, it's probably going to have to boost its direct support to households, because more households are going to be in fuel poverty. But the key thing is that if you want to lower bills in the medium to long term, it's definitely got to be renewables, because they are the cheapest sources of energy that we have available now. They are by far cheaper than gas, and likely will remain so for good, especially because we're not going to be able to import, or the European market's not going to be able to import cheap Russian pipelined gas from Siberia. So it's going to be more reliant on international gas, basically.
Certainly that may well be true in the medium to long term. In the short term, however, the government is talking about increasing production in the North Sea of our own oil and gas. Now, of course, the Conservative Environment Network is more on the pro-net zero side of things, but do you see a role for particularly North Sea oil and gas in the short term, at the very least, to help with the situation here in the UK?
So I certainly do. I think it's definitely right that we start sweating the assets in the North Sea, and I think the strategy is also going to be announcing a licensing round this summer for some more gas fields like Jackdaw, for example. I think it's perfectly compatible to be using North Sea gas during our transition to net zero. Indeed, we need it. It backs up wind and solar when the wind isn't blowing. Eventually, we're going to have storage solutions like green hydrogen, so we can reduce our gas use for that. But in the meantime, over the next 3 decades, and it is over 3 decades, and people really need to understand this, we're going to need gas to keep the lights on effectively. But there's more than enough in the North Sea, and we can reduce our gas demand through clean energy. So this is the point that net zero and national security and our security of our energy supplies, the best way to do both is without a doubt the transition to clean energy.
That's really interesting that the Conservative Environment Network is in favour of that slight expansion in North Sea oil and gas in the short term. Potentially there's a lot more consensus in the House of Commons than potentially we have been led to believe in recent months with a lot of the heat in the debate. Well, we're finally seeing some light and indeed a very interesting strategy this morning. But for now, Jack Richardson of the Conservative Environment Network, thank you very much for joining us here on The Briefing this afternoon.